Thank you all for taking the time to join the Fair Work Ombudsman's webinar today, examining some common questions that we receive regarding the building and construction industry. So my name is Ryan. In the spirit of reconciliation, the Fair Work Ombudsman acknowledges the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their continuing connections to land, sea, waters, sky and community. We pay our respect to them, their cultures, and their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So today I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri land, or Naarm, or Melbourne as it's known. Now, whether you're a chippy or a brickie, painting a door or tiling a floor, running the show, or just starting your apprenticeship, it's important to understand the rights, entitlements, and obligations in the industry. I do want to stress that this is an introductory level webinar, and that while there may be some complex information provided, the contents are really best suited to those who may be employing for the first time or those who are in the early stages of their career in the sector. We will be looking at questions on award coverage, some information on different allowances, including what happens in severe weather conditions, and we'll delve into some questions about apprenticeship entitlements as well. We'll also show you a few different resources you can access, but don't worry about writing those down. For those who registered for the live webinar, we'll be sending you an email shortly after the session with some key links on what we've discussed. And for those who are viewing the recording of this webinar, you will be able to access the links in the description below. But let's now get started with the webinar. So firstly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are, and that's the Fair Work Ombudsman and what we do. So in Australia, all employees have rights and entitlements at work, and these rights and entitlements are protected by laws. The Fair Work Ombudsman is an Australian government agency. We provide workplace advice, education, and assistance to employees, employers, and organisations for free. And we promote and monitor compliance with workplace laws. We are impartial, which means that we do not represent employees or employers. And that's an important point because sometimes we encounter misconceptions about who we can assist. So please note that our free services and advice are available to all workplace participants, employers, employees, and their representatives. We also help resolve workplace problems, and we have tailored tools and resources. And as I said, we'll be sharing links with those with you after the session or in the description below. So let's get into the main content now. So another quick point I'd like to make is that we won't be going through the wage rates in the industry, as there are a lot of variations between different roles and jobs, particularly in the sub-industries as well in the building construction sector. So it is best to look for rates by using our paying conditions tool, and you can see that on the screen there, and I've popped the link up there. The calculator can assist you in finding the relevant rates, but also allowances and penalties, things like overtime for you or your employees' roles. And we will ask qualifying questions along the way to ensure that the information that is being provided by the tool is correct. If you have registered for My Account, you can also save that information to your account. Now, if you would like to see a demonstration of this tool or any of the other tools that are available on our website, you can visit the calculator itself, or you can check out one of our previous demonstration webinars for employers or employees, respectively, by visiting fairwork.gov.au/webinars and going to the recorded webinar section for our collection of on-demand webinars. And of course, this is a friendly reminder that if you are checking wages prior to 1st of July to 2026, these wages are subject to change with any reviews that come up. So it's worth popping a note in the diary around 1st of July just to make sure to see if there's any changes with rates and allowances after that date. Another topic that we cannot provide information on, but we have had a couple of questions on registration, was to do with the portable long service leave in the sector. So for information and help with long service leave issues, please contact your relevant state or territory body, and you can find more information on our website at www.fairwork.gov.au/building under the section Other Help Available. So let's have a look at some award coverage. Now, most entitlements and pay rates are set by an award or an enterprise agreement that applies to an employee. So the first thing I'm going to do is touch base on the Building Construction General On-Site Award, or Building Award as I'll refer to it to save some time, and who it applies to. So to kick things off in the industry, I thought it might be useful to look at the coverage clause of the Building Award. Now, there are two criteria that need to be met to be covered by this award. Firstly, it needs to cover the industry of the employer. So the Building Award is an industry award. It covers employers who are in the on-site building, engineering, and civil construction industry. The award has a specific definition of what this means and who is in and out. You can find the full definition in clause 4.3 of the award. Then there needs to be a classification that fits that employee's job. So if the employer is in the industry and the employee has a classification in the award, the Building Award will apply to them. For example, a clerical or administrative employee working for a construction business cannot be covered by the award. Although the construction business is in the industry covered by the award, there is no classification that meets the duties performed by the employee, so the Building Award cannot cover administrative employees. On the other hand, an employee may work as a carpenter or a brickie, which there is a classification for. However, if the employee is not in the on-site building, engineering, or civil construction industry, the employee cannot be covered by the Building Award. So often what we hear on our Infoline is that people go straight to the classifications before checking whether or not an employer is covered by the industry. So to help clarify this position, I thought it might be useful to look at some of the less obvious roles that we get asked about and whether or not they could actually be covered by the Building and Construction Award, and if not, what might exclude them. So let's start with someone who is installing insulation. So as I mentioned on the last slide, it depends on whether the insulation work is being done and what the nature of the employer's industry will be. It also requires a classification to cover the employee. So for an installation installer, if the employer is operating in an industry covered by the Building Award, in this case, an employer whose primary nature is on-site installation, and the role the employee is doing is covered by the award, in this case, an insulator, then the employee would be covered by the Building Award. However, if the primary nature of the business was, say, electrical services provided by electrical contractors, or the employer was mostly engaged in manufacturing of insulation material, the installation is then a byproduct of the business, then the electrical award or the manufacturing award could apply. So let's have a look at another example that we commonly get, and that's fence installers. So where a business is solely installing, repairing, or removing fencing on sites and provides no other services, an employee involved in the installation of fences would generally be covered by the Building Award. But if if the business is manufacturing fencing and then installing on site or repairing, those employees involved could be covered under the manufacturing award again. However, if someone is just repairing fences as part of the general duties for, say, an agricultural or horticultural or pastoral business that just forms part of the general duties, then different awards could apply again, such as the pastoral or horticultural award. So another one that we're going to have a look at is the someone who is doing floor laying or flooring layer. So again, if the business solely operates on an installation basis, sourcing the flooring from suppliers and only operating to lay flooring on site, then their employees who are laying the floors will generally be covered by the Building Award, as there is coverage for a floor layer in the award classification. However, if a floor layer is based out of a shop or a showroom, and then they go out on site and install flooring for clients from the showroom as part of the sales approach, the general retail award could actually apply, as it has coverage for people undertaking this kind of work, even at a trade level. And the industry is deemed to be that of a retail service, so it wouldn't necessarily be the building service in that circumstance. But if an employer is in the manufacturing and installing business, once again, the coverage for floor laying staff will be under the manufacturing award and on an occupational basis. We'll look at one more, and this is probably a bit more of an obscure one or a niche one, but it does come up as a question regularly on our info line. So that is someone who is a pool builder and a pool installer. So for someone who is whose employer and primary role is in the building, repairing, restoring, resurfacing, retiling or tiling, or painting pools, then they actually have coverage under the Building Award. But if they're actually manufacturing shells off site and they're doing any pool servicing, for example, fixing pumps or filters or checking and testing water, then they will have coverage under the manufacturing award. Now, if they are just cleaning pools, then it is very likely that they may have coverage under the cleaning award. As you can see, it is important to establish the employer's industry first, then the employee's role, and whether or not the building award provides coverage for both. So as I said, there are a number of well-meaning employers who will look at one or the other, deciding that one might fit and then decide that that's the case, but not looking at both in conjunction. And that's where mistakes can be made, and either underpayments or even in cases overpayments can be made. Now, there is a resource that we have, which is our online library, and this has a number of articles on different award coverage for roles within the building industry and many other industries as well. And it's certainly not limited to those I've gone through above. So I would encourage you to check out the library by visiting www.fairwork.gov.au/library for more information. But now we know the award coverage, how do we work out what to include in the wages? This brings us to our second. So what allowances should be included in an employee's wage? The Building and Construction Award has a number of allowances that need to be considered depending on the type of work that the employee is undertaking. They can be paid per hour, day, week, or per occasion, depending on what the award states for each allowance. Under the Building Award, all employees get an industry allowance, which is an all-purpose allowance. An all-purpose allowance is an allowance that is added to an employee's hourly rate, and this pay rate is paid for all purposes, which include the calculation of penalties, loadings, and some paid leave. If an employee is entitled to receive it, then the following are also considered all-purpose allowances. That includes a tool allowance, including protective clothing and equipment, and this will generally apply to certified tradespeople and above. Underground allowance, where applicable, carpenter diver allowance, electrician's license allowance, lift industry allowance, and leading hand allowance. The tool allowance will depend on the qualification and role being performed by a tradesperson and varies. So definitely worth having a look at that. Again, you can use the calculator. Other allowances are conditional and require certain tasks to be performed or certain conditions to be met. And these include, but certainly not limited to, things like multi-story work, someone receiving a first aid allowance, someone who is in charge of a plant, and someone who holds a scaffolding or rigging certificate. There are also different travel and distance allowances, which we will look at shortly. But as I said, there are a number of different allowances to consider, and the best way to explore what applies to you or your employees is to use our pay and conditions tool, which has the allowances built in, and a series of questions and prompts to determine what does and doesn't apply. It's also going to help you to calculate penalties and loadings, taking into account the all-purpose allowances that I mentioned earlier. But while we're on the topic of tools, another one that we get quite often is what happens if tools are stolen. So, and that generally we mean from an on-site, from a building site. So the Building Award states that employees are entitled to be reimbursed by the employer for tools that are stolen whilst either stored on a building site or the employee's premises at this employer's request or discretion. These are also entitled to reimbursement of the missing tools if the tools are stolen whilst being transported. So let's have a look at a case study on this. This is Jason's story. So Jason is a carpenter working on a residential construction site. As part of his work, Jason is required to maintain many power tools. These tools are too bulky to transport home each night, so Jason's employer, Stefano, directs him to store these tools overnight on the actual building site. Unfortunately, overnight, the work site is broken into and some of Jason's tools are stolen. Jason provides Stefano with a list of what has been taken and they file a police report. Jason then replaces the tools that were stolen and he is reimbursed by Stefano for the total costs of replacing the tools. Now, this reimbursement also applies when tools are damaged by fire that occurs at the job site or an employer's premises, and for any personal items that are damaged by corrosive or harmful substances while at work. And for the purpose of damage, personal items can mean tools, protective clothing, any visual aids such as glasses, or hearing aids as well. Let's have a look now at some of the travel allowances, because this is one that we do get a lot of questions on and a lot of people needing to clarify. So under the building award, there are fares and travel allowances, and this is under clause 26.1, which provides an employee with a daily allowance to get to and from work each day. An employee will be entitled to the daily fares and travel allowance if their work starts and finishes at the construction site and they're not already getting the distant work allowance. So this includes if they do any prefabricated construction work at a depot and then go on site to install. Please note that this allowance will not apply if the employer offers to provide or arrange transport to pick up and drop off the employee at home, or if the employer provides a fully maintained work vehicle free of charge. So as an example, Nick works as a carpenter. His boss can provide him with a lift on Monday to Wednesday from his home to the worksite and back again. But on Thursday and Friday, Nick has to make his own way home and to the job site. Nick would be entitled to the fares and travel allowance on Thursday and Friday as he has to make his own way to work, but not Monday to Wednesday as his boss is providing him with transport. Also, any travel done during the shift, for example, between different job sites or to pick up supplies from elsewhere, this time counts as time worked, and the employees who are required to use their own vehicle will also receive a vehicle allowance or an allowance to cover the reasonable cost of public transport between the sites. But what happens if the job sites aren't local? So there's two different entitlements that we're going to look at here. One where the employee can easily return home after a shift, and one where they may be required to stay on or near a building site for a duration. So let's look at the former first, where employees can easily return home. So under the building award, distant work occurs when both of the following apply. The construction site is located outside the metropolitan radial area of where the employee lives, and the employee is required to travel more than 50 kilometres from their home to the construction site. Now, one of the inquiries we get often about this is how to determine where the 50-kilometre radius is measured from. And often employers make the mistake of measuring from their own business or depot. But the radius is actually measured from either the general post office, if the employee lives in a capital city, or the principal post office of the regional city or town that the employer lives in. So please note, the employee does not get the entitlement if the first construction site worked on was more than 50 kilometres from their home when they were initially hired. So what does the employee get for travelling to distant work? Well, they must be paid for reasonable time spent travelling outside of their ordinary working hours each day. And this is rounded to the next quarter of an hour with a minimum payment of 30 minutes for each trip. They must also be reimbursed for travel expenses incurred, such as the travel allowance for each kilometre travelled. Find that under the board as well. If an employee is getting payment for distant work, they are not entitled to overtime fees for the additional time spent travelling. The time spent travelling does not also count towards things like annual leave or personal leave accrual. Okay, sometimes though, a construction site might be located so far away that it is unreasonable for an employee to return home each day. And this is where a living away from home allowance applies. So, an employee who qualifies for this entitlement is to receive a payment to cover all reasonable costs for accommodation and meals, or the living away from home allowance under clause 25, whichever is the higher of the two. So alternatively, an employee can be provided with accommodation and 3 adequate meals per day, or provided with accommodation and be reimbursed all reasonable meal expenses. If the employee is living in a camp, then they are to be provided all meals and accommodation for free. Let's have a look at how this works in practice. So in this scenario, Taylor works for a road construction company as a labourer, and he's based in Adelaide. But for Taylor's next work site, they're going to be doing some work on a major highway repairs on a stretch of road near Woomera in the state's north. So as Woomera is over 500 kilometres from his home, Taylor is unable to reasonably travel to and from his home to the new work site each day. So Taylor's employer, Joe, organises a short-term rental for him and some of the other employers to share in town while they're away and performing the work. Taylor won't receive an allowance for accommodation while on distant work, as suitable accommodation was provided. Because the short-term rental has cooking facilities, Joe gives Taylor and the other employees the option of cooking for themselves or eating out, and then Joe will then reimburse them at the end of the week for their expenses. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and have a look what happens when weather conditions create unsuitable working conditions. So given that the construction industry is a largely outdoor affair, there can be times when Mother Nature has her say and makes working conditions less than ideal. And this is where the inclement weather clause comes into play. So this is clause 24 under the award for those who are playing along at home, and is often misunderstood. As a result, we do get a number of inquiries about this. So the inclement weather clause under the building award only applies to employees in classifications under the general building construction stream and the civil construction stream. Another common mistake that is made within the inclement weather clause is that it is often assumed that it only applies to rainy conditions. However, things like hail, extreme temperatures, high winds, and even dust storms can be considered as severe weather conditions that may trigger the inclement weather provisions. The employer, when requested by the employees or their representative, must confer within a reasonable time to determine whether or not the conditions meet the definition of unreasonable or unsafe to continue working. And if this is the case, then the employees must cease work immediately. There are special rules that are in place where, say, a concrete pour has already commenced, or where there's emergency work that's required to be done, and you'll need to consult the award in these circumstances. There are a few technicalities and things that need to be looked at. But if employees cannot be reasonably re-engaged in duties under their classification without exposure to the inclement conditions, they are entitled to be paid a maximum of 32 hours inclement weather pay at the employee's ordinary hourly rate for each 4-week cycle, or pro rata for part-timers or casuals based on their rostered hours. Now, this cycle is set by the award and has a specific start date. There are plenty of services in the industry and like their industry representatives that do provide free copies of this calendar depicting the 4 weeks, including the Master Builders Associations in each state. But at the end of each 4-week period, this amount resets. Another question that we often get with inclement weather is with new starters who can commence work within a 4-week cycle. So depending on when they actually start in that 4-week cycle, so say they start in the first week of the 4 weeks, they get a reduced amount equating to 8 hours per week by the amount of weeks left in the 4-week cycle. So as an example, if there's 1 week left, they're only entitled to 8 hours. If there's 2 weeks left in the cycle, 16 hours, etc. Also, the inclement weather does not necessarily apply across the whole building site. So if there are employers who are unexposed to or unaffected by the weather conditions, they would be required to continue working until a time that it was deemed that it was not reasonable or unsafe to continue. So let's have a look at another case study. This time we're having a look at Dan's situation. So Dan is a brickie working on a residential construction site without any covered working areas. One day the weather turns up while he's working at the building site and raining heavily, and the updated weather forecast predicts hail. Dan speaks to his foreman Angelo, who directs him and his workmates to stop working. Angelo must record the time that the work stops and assess the weather for when it is suitable for Dan and the team to return to work. Dan asks whether they will still get paid, Angelo confirms that all the employees will continue to get their usual pay because they are stopped working due to the inclement weather, and that no other work can be undertaken where employees aren't exposed to the elements. Angelo says that he will let Dan and his workmates know when it will be safe to work again and will record the time of recommencement. And as I said, payment for the time lost due to inclement weather is a maximum of that 32 hours in a 4-week period. All right, we're in the home stretch now. I'll go through a few of the questions we get asked about apprenticeships in the industry. The first being related to off-the-job training. Any apprentice undertaken will usually require off-the-job training or attendance at trade school, such as TAFE. This is part of the training arrangement and a requirement to pass the qualification, so an employer cannot prevent their apprentice from attending off-the-job training. For most apprentices, this is either full-time or part-time. Time spent in off-the-job training and assessment counts as time worked, and this means that an apprentice must get their normal pay and accrue their leave entitlement. Regular apprentices, including adult apprentices, get their allowances when attending trade school. However, they are not entitled to receive the travel fares and distant work payment. Now, school-based apprentices are different, so they don't get their ordinary hours for time spent training. Instead, school-based apprentices are compensated for off-the-job training in the form of a loading on their ordinary hours rather than payment for the actual time. So they get a 25% loading, which is paid on top of their time worked on the job. Now, there are some circumstances where attending a day's training per week isn't plausible, especially where the registered training organisation is a long distance from the employer's business or the employee's residence. And in these circumstances, some registered training organisations may require apprentices to attend what we call block training or block release training. This is a period of condensed off-the-job training that may require an apprentice to attend trade school or TAFE for several days or weeks in a row. Where it is unreasonable for an employee to return home from off-site training each night, employers may be responsible for covering the travel expenses of an apprentice who is attending block training release. This is paid using a similar method to the living away from home allowance that we looked at earlier. But let's have a look at another case study. This time we're looking at Chen, who is a first-year carpentry apprentice working in a remote central Queensland. His closest TAFE is in Bundaberg, which is a 4-hour drive from his hometown. So Chen has to complete a full week's block training release at the TAFE in Bundaberg in order to move to second year. Because it's too far to travel to the TAFE each day, Chen's boss is required to cover reasonable excess costs, and this include the transportation, accommodation, and any other reasonable expenses, including his meals. We're going to look at some different apprentice conditions now, particularly if an apprentice starts their apprenticeship after turning 21. So the award defines an employee who is 21 years of age or over at the time of signing the contract of training as an adult apprentice. And they have a couple of different conditions to younger apprentices. So when an adult apprentice starts their apprenticeship, they're entitled to the lowest rate provided to an adult under the building award. In this case, under the award, it's a level 1 CW or ECW level A rate. They are entitled to this rate for the entirety of the apprenticeship, taking into account any wage increases that come from minimum wage reviews each year, or until a time where the apprentice rate for a junior apprentice surpasses that amount. It's often worth comparing, particularly once you get to fourth year, whether that rate is now higher than the level 1, level A rate. However, if an employee was already working with an employer immediately prior to commencing their apprenticeship, they will not suffer a reduction in their ordinary hourly rate and would stay on the rate that they were immediately on prior to entering the training contract, provided that they had been employed for at least 6 months as a weekly hire employee or 12 months as a daily hire employee, and that's immediately prior to commencing that contract. Okay, we have one more common question that we have, and that's to do with termination and specifically the industry-specific redundancy scheme. So this is another one of those building and construction industry entitlements that does catch some people out, particularly if they've worked in other industries. And this is the industry-specific redundancy, which applies in place of the entitlements under the National Employment Standards under the Fair Work Act. And what this means is that the building award has different rules about when a redundancy happens, who the redundancy applies to, or who the rules apply to, and how much redundancy pay needs to be paid. The industry-specific redundancy scheme also means that employees' redundancy pay can come from a redundancy pay scheme if the employer makes contributions to one. So what does this mean in practice? Well, under the building award, an employee is made redundant when the employee is either fired or resigns or is dismissed because the employer becomes insolvent or bankrupt. So it's really important to note here that unlike other industries where a redundancy comes as a result of a position no longer be required to be done by anybody in the business, in the building industry, this is not necessarily the case. This is when someone is terminated or resigns for reasons other than serious misconduct or refusal of duty. So in those cases, the redundancy isn't paid. And unlike many other industries, these rules also apply to small business and their employees. Now, also worth noting, apprentices are not entitled to redundancy payments. Employees other than casuals are still required to be provided with relevant notice under the award. Please note there are differences between daily hire and weekly hire employees when it comes to providing notice as well. And if you need assistance in calculating the redundancy pay under the building award, you can use our pay and conditions tool that I mentioned at the top of this webinar, and that will be included in the links you get provided. So for our final case study of the presentation, we'll have a look at Gary's situation. But Gary worked as a labourer for a small construction business for 11 months, working on a small commercial site. He was covered under the building award, and Gary had only planned to work on this particular project, and he resigned upon its completion. The industry-specific redundancy scheme in the building award entitles Gary to redundancy pay even though he has worked less than a year and even though he resigned. Gary uses the pay and conditions tool to calculate how much he is entitled to, and based on his 11 months of service, the tool says that Gary is entitled to 82.25 hours of redundancy pay. So that brings us to the end of our common questions about the building industry that we receive. And if you do have any further questions or would like assistance with determining award coverage or conditions to wages, there's a few ways you can do it. The first one I'd like to show you is through our employer advisory service. So this is specifically for our small business employers who have joined us today. The Employer Advisory Service, or EAS, is a specialised service that offers you free, tailored written advice, and the aim is to help employers to meet their obligations to employees. Now, the EAS does not offer legal advice, but can help to explain the Fair Work Act, the Building Award, or even the National Employment Standards in more detail. The service specialises in distilling legislation into a written form that is easy to understand and you can rely on its accuracy. So to access the EAS, you just need to be a small business employer, so someone who has 15 or less employees, and your inquiry needs to be about the areas that we can advise on. Now you can contact the EAS by visiting fairwork.gov.au/EAS or by using our contact details to write in or call in and request assistance from the EAS. It may also be worth checking out our small business showcase, which you can find at fairwork.gov.au/smallbusiness. The other place you can get in touch, and this is for everybody else, well, including small business, is our Fair Work info line, which is 131394. If you do require translating and interpreting service, that number, it's a free service, that number is 131450. If you need to want to get written advice, you can register for our My account. and you can see the link there as well. I've also popped the link up for our building industry portal. So it has a lot of the information that we have covered today, plus plenty more. You can visit that at fairwork.gov.au/building. And if you'd like to find out more about the webinars that we put on, similar to this one, and to view any previously recorded webinars that we have up, like I said, the tool webinars at the top, you can visit fairwork.gov.au/webinars. So there will be a short survey once this webinar ends, and we would love your feedback. It will only take a minute or two to complete, and the feedback helps us to continue to shape our webinar offerings. So thank you for your attendance today, and I hope that we see you at another webinar in the future.